I was only 19 when I became pastor of my own church in the coal regions of Pennsylvania, so that's one connection that you and I have. And I served 12 years before I got elected to Congress by accident at age 31, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Mark Buchan is one of my heroes. If you see a film called The United States of Alec, done by a guy by the name of Bill Moyers, this guy Mark Buchan stars in that film because Mark, you see this t-shirt that you had out there? Mark's just as great. He had called out the group, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and I really like him, and I'm so glad he got elected to Congress because he can help us with a lot of issues, including the constitutional amendment, and I just thought I should wear this t-shirt just so, because I want to introduce Jay Heck, who is he's our executive director here in Wisconsin. And the reason I want to introduce him while I'm putting the shirt on is because he sent to my executive assistant on Friday a message saying, don't dress too formally. This is Wisconsin. And I showed up in a tie and a suit, and I knew it would make him uncomfortable, but I also want to show you the tie that I'm wearing. It has Mickey Mouse on it, and you probably think I got this at Disney World. I actually got it in Vietnam. I took 2 delegations to Vietnam, including Pat Schroeder, former congresswoman from Colorado, and what we were doing was investigating the issue of Agent Orange, the defoliant that was used in Vietnam. We think it's impacted our veterans. It's actually still killing and maiming the children and grandchildren of the Vietnamese. And so I took a couple delegations to Vietnam recently for the Ford Foundation, and I tell really, really bad jokes. And so they bought this tie in Hanoi. I'm sure it's not copyrighted. I'm sure it's kind of ripped off, but it's a nice one, so I'll put it back down there. Let me first tell you a joke. This is my favorite joke, and if you don't like it, that's okay. I need to get it out of my system. It's the story of the mother mouse that walks across the field, and she has behind her all her baby mice, all the little mices. She's just as happy as can be. She gets about halfway across the field. You guessed it, a large cat came in the other direction. The mother mouse gets up on her hind legs to protect the little ones. She looks the cat in the eye and she says, "Bow wow!" And the cat runs off, and the mother mouse turns to the little ones and says, "Now you know the value of a second language." I feel better. Now, I need you guys to help me with my opening lecture. And I'm going to try to give this lecture in 3 sentences. And then I'm going to take 20 minutes to explain. Okay? But in order to help me, if you are able, I know you've got papers and things. If you're able, it'd be good if you could stand up for this first part. It's pretty easy. Just stand up. And you guys have done this before. If you're not able, that's fine. But if you're able, stand up. I want you to repeat after me. Corporations.
Corporations
are important.
Are important.
Corporations.
Corporations
are not people.
Are not people.
You're good. Here's the second one. Money.
Money
is really good.
is really good.
Money
Money
can give speech.
can give speech.
Money
Money
can stifle speech.
can stifle speech.
And here's the most important one. We are.
We are.
We are.
We are.
The leaders.
The leaders.
We have been waiting for.
We have been waiting for.
You may be seated. In February of 1968, I was a young seminarian at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. And I was invited to go to Washington for the first time by a guy by the name of Bill Coffin. Bill was the chaplain at Yale University, and he was gathering a group of laymen and clergy who were concerned about the Vietnam War. I got in a bus and we drove through New Jersey, through Delaware, down into Maryland, and we got to the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. In order to get into the church, we had to cross a picket line. And I grew up in a blue-collar family told never to cross a picket line. But this picket line was led by the equivalent of Pat Robertson. It was a guy by the name of Carl McIntyre who was carrying a big sign that said, "Kill a commie for Christ's sake." As someone preparing for ministry, I went into the church, went up into the balcony, and listened to speaker after speaker make the connection between war and poverty. We're having that same conversation now. Here we've got the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and the largest tax cut in the history of the United States. And both Democrats and Republicans are wringing their hands, wondering why we have such large deficits and debt. I have 5 honorary doctorate degrees and 5 arrests for civil disobedience. I'm delicately balanced. My last arrest was focused on praying in the rotunda of the Capitol. Much like you have this great Capitol here, a group of 11 of us prayed in the Capitol. We got arrested for obstructing the House and Senate. We just simply said the House and Senate guys could walk around us. But anyway, we got arrested. But we were trying to speak on behalf of the voiceless, average, ordinary citizens who get consumed by corporate money and by wealthy donors that we saw in this last election. Anyway, I listened to speaker after speaker, and the keynote speaker was this young 39-year-old preacher who came to the podium to speak. His name was Dr. Martin Luther King. And Dr. King was assassinated 5 weeks later. And when I got elected by accident to Congress as part of the Watergate baby class, I volunteered to be on the Select Committee on Assassinations, looking into the death of Dr. King and John F. Kennedy. I'm one of the few people who actually interviewed James Earl Ray, the assassin. I like the dreamer better. Here are 2 things that Dr. King said. First, you and I will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of bad people, but for the appalling silence of good people. But listen to these words. It's a little longer, but it's an important quote. It's in a book that he wrote in 1967 called "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" Dr. King said this. He said, "We're now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us bare, naked, and dejected with lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of humanity does not remain at the flood, it ebbs. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage. But time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late." He closes his comments by saying, "We still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. This may well be humankind's last chance to choose between chaos and community." We're here to talk about Citizens United. Why does that connect to the kind of passion that a courageous group of leaders led the civil rights movement back in the 60s, and a courageous group of women led the women's rights movement, and a courageous group of peace activists worked very hard? We're getting overwhelmed by the corrosive influence of money in politics. I've got a friend who you may have seen on television, a guy by the name of Bill Moyers. Bill gave the keynote speech at the 40th anniversary of Common Cause, and he gave it in 2010, just about 9 months after the terrible Citizens United decision came down. That was a decision 5-4. If Sandra Day O'Connor had still been in the Supreme Court, it would have been 5-4 the other way. It was a very close decision. Bill Moyers was introduced at 9 o'clock at night in Washington, and nobody stays up past 9 o'clock in Washington, but no one left this big hall. And in the middle of his speech, he said something that was very powerful. He said, "This is the most dangerous moment in American history for democracy. We're either going to be a nation that's of and by and for the people, or of and by and for large corporations and the wealthy." I was empowered by that speech. And Common Cause, that's been around for 43 years, was empowered by that speech. We called out the Koch brothers in January of 2011 before they became famous here in Wisconsin because they had contributed to your governor. We called them out in Rancho Mirage, California, and we also, in the process of that, by accident, discovered Justice Scalia had not filed his financial statements properly. We thought only for 6 years. He renovated 21 years. We found Justice Scalia going to Tea Party events, and we discovered that if they had been under the Judicial Code of Ethics, Justice Scalia would have been brought up on charges. But the problem, and you should know this, the Supreme Court exempted themselves from the Judicial Code of Ethics. Has no rules of recusal. If Justice Roberts gets a complaint about one of the justices, he gives it to the justice to decide because he believes that nobody can be over the Supreme Court. We've gotten involved in other things. You're going to hear us talk with David and others about amending the Constitution. Last year we stepped out on that issue, and I'll talk about that in the next panel. We also, some of you know about the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, where Mark Pocan has been quite effective and a hero. My staff found a small agency inside the IRS that's a whistleblower agency. Organizations like Common Cause can't file whistleblower complaints, but Bob and his wife Merle Edgar last May filed a whistleblower complaint. We took 4,800 documents and gave them to the IRS, and this agency is mandated to investigate. And what we discovered is that these 2,000 conservative state legislators sitting side by side with big corporate and wealthy persons for 40 years have filed with the IRS as a charity.
Oh my.
If you give them $1,000, you can take it off on your income tax. And yet 75 to 80% of their work is hardcore lobbying. Now, you didn't come to hear about all of that. You didn't come to hear about Common Cause. But Common Cause is trying to be uncommon. And I brought a word to Common Cause that might be helpful to you here in Wisconsin. It's a word I invented when I was General Secretary of the National Council of Churches. We had 36 different churches representing 45 million persons of faith. All the churches wanted to end poverty, but only if they got credit for it. And so we invented this word, ego disarmament. And you're going to see that exhibited today because all of you as coalitional leaders here in Wisconsin, joined by coalitional leaders around the country, we need to be the leaders we've been waiting for. We need to drop our individual egos, and especially our institutional egos, and come together and deep frame issues. And pushing back on Citizens United is an important opportunity for us. And it's a way for us to say, we need to take democracy back. Let me ask you a question that I'm going to ask at the end of my comments. If you are the leaders we've been waiting for, are you ready to be the founding fathers and mothers of democracy moving forward? Are you ready to protect democracy and make sure that we elect public officials who serve the public interest and not the special interest? Are you ready to push back on the corrosive influence of money in politics? Because if you're not ready to engage, if you're not ready to be the people we've been waiting for, the leaders we've been waiting for, we're in big trouble. Now here's some specifics about Citizens United, and throughout the day you'll get into more detail. Citizens United was a kind of technical, small case that drifted up to the Supreme Court. It involved a movie that was trashing Hillary Clinton. And this movie was made by some ultra-conservatives, and they wanted to take this movie and show it around the country so that Hillary Clinton would not be able to be the candidate for president. And that's not illegal. It's not necessarily bad. But the Federal Election Commission thought that the people putting the movie together should in fact comply with federal election laws. They should fully disclose who their donors were. And the group, Citizens United, decided they didn't want to tell us who the people were that were funding the movie. And so it went through the court process. It was a case between the people who created the movie and the Federal Election Commission. Now, in 2009, the Supreme Court had that case. And you may not know this, but the Supreme Court opens October 1st, takes all kinds of cases, decides on those cases by June 30th. They're going to decide this year on civil marriage. They're going to decide on a number of things. In June, there'll be a flurry of activity. On the 30th of June, they'll all go on vacation and come back on October 1st. This case came in October of '08, was before the courts, was heard in the courts. Justice Roberts had just gotten to the court just a year or two before, and he was the leader of the court. They looked at the case. They came to June when all of us expected that they were going to decide, and they did an extraordinary thing. They took the case off of the docket and held it over and had a very special session of the Supreme Court in September of '09, not in October, September. It's interesting. And then in, you're telling me something. 45. I have 45 minutes left? No, I'm just teasing. Anyway, they took this case, and September, October, November, finally in December, they ruled on the case. And the case was 5-4, as I said earlier. And it basically said that labor unions and corporations could dip into their corporate treasury and spend that on campaigns. Now, some of you remember in your history books a guy by the name of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy was a Republican president of the United States. And in 1907, Teddy Roosevelt signed into law the Tillman Act. And the Tillman Act was pushing back against the railroad barons and the coal interests and the people who were buying Montana, because corporations prior to 1907 were buying up democracy. And Teddy Roosevelt, Republican president, was concerned about that and signed the Tillman Act into law. Citizens United did away with most of the campaign finance laws going back to 1907. It had a major impact. Now, I have to be honest. Prior to that decision, Common Cause was concerned that if corporations could use their corporate treasury, okay, that corporations would, in fact, dominate elections and buy their way in. They have to some degree, but the decision has impacted less on corporations buying democracy for one basic reason. Many corporations, Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola, Johnson & Johnson, Kraft Foods, Walmart, they may want to dip into their corporate treasury, but they want flaky liberals and independents and people that they don't necessarily support politically. They want them to buy at their store. So those corporations that care about brand identity didn't suddenly jump in. The corporations that don't care about what you think, they did jump in. And about 25% of the money in the 2012 political election came from corporations, many of them giving their money anonymously, some of them giving it to the Chamber of Commerce in Washington, who bought commercials. And the 2012 election was the most expensive election in the history of the United States by a large margin. It wasn't all due to Citizens United, although the Citizens United decision essentially did away with all the rules and regulations on money in politics. And that, coupled with the fact that the Federal Election Commission's broken, a candidate can do almost anything they want. And they can raise as much money as they want. Some estimates are that there was about $7 billion spent in this last campaign. Obama raised $1.1 billion. He didn't like the Citizens United decision, but I was a little critical of Obama because he set up his super PAC, and his political advisors said, we don't want to disarm. I don't want the president to disarm either. I want him to lead and push back on money in politics. Romney raised $1 billion. Super PACs raised a lot of money. And here's an interesting fact. Half of the money raised by super PACs were raised by 100 people who could fit in this room. As Bill Moyer said, democracy is in danger, and Citizens United is impacting on that. Now, there are things you can do about it. One interesting fact about Citizens United is that 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices said that the Congress of the United States ought to pass full disclosure legislation. You here in Wisconsin should pass disclosure legislation. Foreign corporations shouldn't be allowed to meddle in our politics. And anonymous donations shouldn't be allowed to be in political campaigns. 8 of the 9 justices said pass disclosure. The White House wanted it. The bipartisan legislation passed the House of Representatives. It went over to the Senate, and it got 59 votes in the United States Senate. But because it didn't have 60 votes, it wasn't even discussed because of the filibuster. And that's one of the reasons Common Cause is filing in the federal courts. We believe the filibuster is actually unconstitutional, and I'd be glad to argue that issue with you. It's not in the Constitution. It was invented by Aaron Burr 20 years after the Constitution. Wasn't named a filibuster until 50 years later, and up till 1970 it was used more often to protect slavery and lynching laws than it was human rights and civil rights and people's rights. And a group of conservative senators have used it over 100 times every year of the last 6 years. How many of you remember Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the 1939 movie? There were 0 filibusters that year. There have been over 100 filibusters, including things like disclosure, the DREAM Act. Even health care was watered down because it needed 60 votes even just to be discussed. And you saw this week that the gun legislation broke the filibuster a little bit, but they still have an opportunity at the end of the discussion to filibuster again. And if you go back and read the Federalist Papers, founding fathers argued persuasively that we shouldn't have democracy based on supermajority votes. That's why they put 7 supermajority votes in the Constitution. So today, as we talk about how to fix Citizens United, we're going to talk about amending the Constitution. Mike and Dave and others have comments to make about that that are very important for you to hear. We're going to talk about disclosure legislation. If the federal government doesn't pass it, states need to pass it quickly so that we have full disclosure. We need to talk about the Supreme Court and the quality of the Supreme Court and whether the Supreme Court ought to have a code of ethics. By the way, Justice Clarence Thomas's wife got $500,000 from a corporation after Citizens United wasn't available to her before. We think there's a conflict of interest there. We can talk about some of that in your questioning. But we also need to make sure that we ask the next Supreme Court justices to really be forthcoming in terms of their position on money and politics. I close with this. If you want to walk fast, walk alone. If you want to walk far, walk together, an African proverb. You are the leaders we've been waiting for. I'll believe corporations are people the day after they have a colonoscopy. I think money is important. Money is speech, but money can stifle speech. And we, in fact, are the only leaders we have to save democracy. Thank you.